All right, welcome to Crisis in Perception. We're all about digging into the big systems that shape our world. And today, we're going after a really big one, a cultural force that's so powerful and so sneaky, it actually shapes how we think and even how we feel about the future.
So, to help us break this down, we're looking at Matt Colquhoun's book, Egress, which really unpacks the work of the cultural theorist Mark Fisher. And hey, just a heads up, this isn't a book report, and it is definitely not life advice. Think of this more like getting a new diagnostic tool, a way to map out this really complex system that honestly affects every single one of us.
To really get to the heart of this whole thing, we've got to start with this core idea from Mark Fisher himself. That feeling right there, that pervasive sense that there is no alternative, that's the problem. That's what we're here to dissect.
So what are we even talking about here? What is this system? Let's actually give it a name and try to understand how it functions. It's almost like a cultural operating system.
The term is capitalist realism. Now, the best way to think about this isn't as some obvious ideology that you either believe in or you don't. No, it's more like the operating system running in the background of society. And what does it do? Well, its main job is to put a ceiling on our collective imagination about what's politically possible. And this is super important. It takes these huge structural problems, like why everyone is so stressed out, and it reframes them as your problem, as an isolated individual thing.
Okay, so how does a cultural operating system like this actually keep itself going? Well, it's all about the incentives it creates. Let's dig into how this really plays out.
And there's a really powerful metaphor that helps explain this. Imagine you're trapped in a completely sealed room, and every single wall is a mirror. You can shout at your reflection, critique it, analyze it, and all that critique just echoes around you endlessly. But here's the thing. With no doors and no windows, all that reflection just replaces any real chance of ever getting out.
And that image, that mirrored room, just perfectly illustrates the incentives at play here. The system pushes for individual coping. Think self-help, meditation apps, instead of a real critique of the structures that are causing the stress in the first place. And get this, it doesn't try to crush dissent, it just absorbs it. A radical slogan? Boom, it's on a t-shirt. It floods our media with these endless images of dystopia and apocalypse, which makes them feel totally inevitable. And then it tries to manage all this widespread distress with what Fisher called bureaucratic anti-production. You know, these impersonal, often privatized, and totally inefficient systems.
Now, these incentives, they don't just happen in a vacuum, right? They produce really consistent, totally predictable consequences that you can see across our entire culture.
So what are the results? Well, we see this widespread melancholia and burnout, which then gets diagnosed as an individual's personal failure. Political action, it often feels totally fragmented, like it just can't get any real traction. We get stuck in these cycles of rebellion that are really just symbolic, and they get absorbed by the market before they can lead to any real structural change. And all of this just fuels that cultural obsession with the end of the world, because honestly, it's become easier to imagine total collapse than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Okay, so that brings us to a really critical question. If these are the outcomes, why is this system so darn resilient? Why is it often so hard to even see it's there?
Let's just ask this directly. We've got soaring rates of anxiety and depression, right? So why is the default diagnosis, almost every time, a problem with an individual's brain chemistry, instead of being seen as a perfectly natural response to the world they're forced to live in?
And this is the crucial point. Fisher argues that the system's core logic, what he calls its ruling ontology, flat out denies that there could even be social causes for mental illness. It insists over and over that the explanation has to be chemical and biological. This fundamental misdiagnosis, that is the crisis in perception at the very heart of why this system persists. It stops us from even looking for a social and political explanation.
And what this does is create this incredibly effective, self-reinforcing loop. The system's logic gets baked into our major institutions, our media, our jobs, even our healthcare. This in turn narrows our perception of what we think is realistic or possible. And because this limited reality is all we ever see, the system's logic just starts to feel like common sense. It feels like the only reality there is.
But this whole perceptual system, it doesn't operate in a bubble. So let's zoom out for a second and see how it connects to some of the other major forces that are shaping our world.
So capitalist realism is deeply intertwined with neoliberal governance. You know, the idea of treating public services like businesses and citizens like customers. It's really the cultural logic that powers platform capitalism, or communicative capitalism, where our online lives and participation just become another resource to be mined. And it has a direct impact on the climate crisis, making the radical systemic changes we desperately need feel totally unimaginable, like a political impossibility.
So, what's the big takeaway here? What do we do with all this? Simply seeing the system, really understanding its incentives, its outcomes, its logic, that is the essential first step. It doesn't magically tear down the walls, but what it does do is turn that confusing, disorienting mirrored room into a map. And once you have a map, you can start to figure out a way out.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a longer audio-based analysis of this topic, see the deep dive linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.